If you've got too much kimchi that's been aging for a while now, you can make this braised pork and kimchi jjim, which really doesn't take long to put together and can be essentially left to cook for a few hours while you go and do something else. I'm starting off with a big chunk of pork shoulder, which in Korea is called moksal, and I went ahead and salted it the day before and left it uncovered in the fridge to kind of dry out the outer layer, which is not really necessary. But my thinking behind doing this was that would help create a better sear on the outside of the pork when I go to pan sear this before braising. And even if it doesn't really do anything, I think it's a cool way to look like you know what you're doing in the kitchen when you whip out a pre-prep piece of meat. Anyway, I'm going to cut these pieces a little smaller just to make them a little easier to handle, and then start heating up a pan to start searing the pork. Now I'm using stainless steel to sear my meat, but you can just use whatever pan you like. I just let the pan get real hot before I add a little bit of oil and spread it out using a silicone brush. But if you don't want to do any extra dishes, just swish the pan around to spread the oil. Then I'm placing the meat in the pan, making sure they're nicely spread out and not touching each other. And they will stick to the pan pretty strong at first, so make sure you nail the placement of the meat on the pan. Eventually, with a little bit of teasing, the meat should release pretty easily from the pan, leaving a nice sear on the surface of the meat. Now I want all sides of this to be seared, so I'm repeating this on all sides of the meat. Right now, we're not actually worried about cooking the meat, just trying to get a nice sear on the outside. Then I'm setting them aside while I pull out my secret weapon. This is aged kimchi. I'm not too sure how old this kimchi would be at this point, but I suspect it could be almost a year old. This type of kimchi is pretty funky, so it isn't usually served raw unless you're into that raw funky stuff, but usually it's just used in cooking. I'd say most Korean families would have a big tub of this type of kimchi somewhere in their kimchi fridge. Like how I found this one after asking my mum if she had any aged kimchi somewhere, and she just told me to check one of their 4 fridges. And if you're wondering about the layer of plastic over top, this is kind of just how kimchi is stored in Korea as a way to prevent air contact on top of the kimchi. And also those white spots you see on the kimchi are not mold. They're in fact little colonies of yeast, and this kimchi is perfectly safe to eat, although you may want to scrape those little spots off. Now this kimchi was made using cabbage halves, and a really big cabbage at that, so I'm going to use only one half of the cabbage, but I'll cut it up into smaller pieces to make them easier to handle. And I'm going to keep this as simple as possible with other vegetables. I'm just using 1 onion, which I'm cutting up into quarters, and then I'm going to cut up 2 green onions into about 2-inch pieces, along with some garlic, which I usually blend up and then freeze into these little squares, and each square amounts to about 1 tablespoon. This is just how much of the vegetables I put in, but you can literally put as much or as little of anything as you want. I use the biggest pot that would fit into my little oven, but it's a heavy stock pot which should work perfectly for this. I just threw everything in, but I decided to make it look a little bit nicer with a little bit of symmetry. I kind of want to make sure everything had good contact with the kimchi too. And oh yeah, I decided to also cut up a chili and throw that in as well. Now this is still looking a little dry, and if I cooked it like this, it would turn out super dry too, and also completely under-seasoned. So what I'll do is I'll add a nice big tablespoon of gochujang, which is a Korean chili paste, and 1 big tablespoon of doenjang, which is Korean fermented soybean paste, to a bowl along with 2 tablespoons of any type of syrup or sweetener. Then mix that in with about 500 milliliters of hot water until it's completely dissolved. That mixture is going to go into the pot with the rest of the ingredients, and then the lid on, and then into the oven, which I've preheated about 160 degrees Celsius. Now I cooked this in the oven for a few hours, however I can't say exactly how long because my oven for some reason keeps shutting itself off from overheating. Imagine that, an oven that overheats. So instead, I checked it every so often until the pork was tender and tears apart easily. When the pork hit that point, I took the lid off and then continued cooking to reduce the liquid and to also get a nice sear on top of everything. I want to say in total it was probably about 4 or 5 hours of cooking in the oven. While the pork is quite tender and falling apart when picked up, the kimchi surprisingly managed to keep its structure and not turn to mush. To serve, I'm going to cook this on some white rice. I actually like to have my rice ever so slightly undercooked, because I prefer the texture a little firmer over mushy or sticky rice. And to serve, I'm just going to lay down a bed of rice first and then just add a little bit of everything to the bowl and then finish with a light sprinkling of sesame seeds. So this might be one of my favorite and actually surprisingly easy things to make, given that you have aged kimchi. But if not, you can always just use regular not so aged kimchi. However, the flavor won't be as deep as using aged kimchi.